Thank you for that introduction. And Travis ended by talking about how useful it will be for us to recognize what we have to offer the world, to embrace our founding ideals, and to recognize the implications they have around the world. And what a great segue. That's largely what I want to talk to you about right now, is the implications of American identity for our foreign policy, and different ways of conceiving of American identity, and the different implications of those different views. America is winning again. America is respected again, because we are putting America first. We're taking care of ourselves for a change, folks. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really? Okay. We're not supposed to use that word. But you know what I am? I'm a nationalist. I'm a nationalist. That was President Donald Trump at a rally in Houston 1 year ago, in October of 2018, invoking nationalism as his preferred political organization, his ism, his political ideology. Trump was appealing to one way of thinking about political organization and thus American identity. Nationalists believe that humanity is divided into mutually distinct, internally coherent groups defined by shared traits like language, religion, or culture, and that these groups should each have their own government. Is this a good way of thinking about human political life? Is this a good way of defining America? And is this a good foundation for foreign policy? Is there an alternative? Well, I think that there is an alternative, and what I want to do today is contrast two different ways of defining American identity, and then teasing out the implications of those two different ways for our foreign policy and our role in the world. We can define American identity creedally or culturally. Creedally or culturally. In the creedal, or civic definition of American identity, we think of America as the nation defined by the American Creed, by the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the ideas of 18th century classical liberalism. Some of our speakers have talked about today. This is what Lincoln meant, I think, when he talked about America as a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. By contrast, the cultural definition, or the nationalist definition of American identity, understands our nation defined not primarily by ideals, but by a shared heritage. Sometimes it's left vague what that heritage is, but recently I've noticed a lot of nationalists growing more specific and more explicit in saying what that shared heritage is. And they label it Anglo-Protestantism, our shared heritage of Anglo-Protestantism. Sort of Amari, Yuval Levine, not Yuval Levine, Yoram Hazony, and others have made this more clear. Right away you might be thinking that these two definitions are actually the same, because you might respond and say, well, Paul, the ideals of the American experiment grew out of our shared Anglo-Protestant heritage, the ideas of the fruit of the heritage. And so, in fact, these two conceptions of American identity, aren't they really the same thing? If we want to keep the one, don't we have to keep the other? Isn't there, at the end of the day, no real difference between these two ideas? Well, I want to respond quick and say, actually, that's precisely what the nationalists would want you to believe. They want you to believe that there's a necessary connection between Anglo-Protestantism and the ideas of liberal democracy. They believe that our cultural heritage is the necessary precondition for the survival of the American experiment. And they argue that to separate the creed from the culture is to misunderstand both. I disagree, and I want to argue that there really are two rival versions of American identity that have real different implications for how we think about public life and America's role in the world. So briefly, I want to demonstrate that by highlighting a few different areas of public life where the difference is very clear. Second, I want to describe the difference in more abstract theoretical terms for any theorists in the room. Third, I want to defend the justice of internationalism. And fourth, I want to conclude with a critique or a rebuke of nationalism. So where do we see the difference between the creedal and the cultural understandings of American identity? First, let's think about immigration. Creedalists would argue that we can restrict immigration as needed for national security reasons, perhaps for economic policy, But a creedalist would look at the cultural diversity that immigration brings and celebrate it, thinking that it's an asset, not a liability. By contrast, the nationalists look at immigration and say often that we should restrict immigration to preserve our demographic or our cultural identity. That we should give priority to immigrants who are predisposed, they say, to accept our ideals and our way of life, usually understood to mean fellow Christians or Europeans. That's a difference in how we look at immigration. A second area is in morals legislation. Okay, how many of you followed the French Amari debate over the summertime? Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. Creedalists, like David French, argues that we, of course, can pass laws to uphold public order and public decency, but the government should otherwise sustain viewpoint neutrality and not privilege one religion or culture or ideology over another. Creedalists are far more hesitant to use the power of the state to kind of put its finger on the scales and pick winners and losers culturally. We should not ban or limit the activities of a group just because we find their views objectionable. Right? This is the argument about drag queen story hour in public libraries. Nationalists, like Sorgomari, argue that we should pass laws to privilege or protect Anglo-Protestant or Western or European cultural norms and standards of morality. Because they say America is and should remain a Christian nation, whose standards of public morality are explicitly derived from our shared Judeo-Christian ethic. And so we should, they say, we should use the power of the government to privilege our values, our way of life. The third area I want to highlight, where the divergence is seen very clearly, and most relevant for this conference, is in foreign policy and America's role in the world. Creedalists understand that the United States is an exemplar of liberty, a city on a hill for all the world to see. And we understand that when other countries follow our example, well, we celebrate, and that's a good thing. And we would say that it's possible, in principle, for the ideals of classical liberalism to be adapted around the world, because the ideals aren't ours. We didn't invent them. They rather are, in principle, universalizable, and other countries around the world can adapt them as they see fit, and that's a good thing. When they do so, we recognize that the spread of American ideals, the spread of liberal ideals, is an asset to American national security. We can trust other like-minded states. We can cooperate with other like-minded states. We can form alliances with them. We can trade with them, cooperate with them. Relations with other democratic states are positive sum. It's a win-win situation. When we have a disagreement with them, we can find a solution that actually benefits us both. That's the great thing about the free world order, that liberal international order. It is a system that works for everyone involved who finds themselves to be a stakeholder in this system. Creedalists recognize that authoritarian powers, it's not the case with them. While authoritarian powers can sometimes be partners of convenience, as was the case with the Soviet Union in World War II, or perhaps today with, unfortunately, Saudi Arabia, we also recognize that over the long term, authoritarian powers are almost certainly going to be rivals, if not enemies, because they envision a different world than we do. They envision a different world than we do. And so ideological similarity is a very convenient marker for alliance and friendship. Ideological dissimilarity is a convenient marker for rivalry at least, if not enmity and hostility at worst. And so we can map the world that way. Nationalists have a very different way of looking at the world. Nationalists espouse the doctrine of America first. Nationalists believe that because they think the American ideals are an organic outgrowth of our particular cultural heritage, they're therefore not universalizable. We cannot and should not try to foster, spread, or champion such ideals around the world. If other countries find their way to democracy, good for them, but it's kind of not our business. President Trump said very clearly on the campaign trail in 2016, our foreign policy began to go wrong when we tried to foster democracy in countries that had no appetite for it. And so nationalists believe that we have no particular interest in seeing democracy spread. We shouldn't try to get involved because it's generally doomed to failure. Instead, we should engage with other nations, both democracies and authoritarian nations, to engage in a zero-sum competition for prestige, power, and wealth. That's what international politics looks like to a nationalist. Nationalists are suspicious of, distrustful of, cooperation, alliances, and international organizations, which they denigrate as, say it with me, globalism. Globalism, dread globalism. So those are three areas where I think we see the difference very clearly between these two rival conceptions of American identity. You define America as the creed, things look one way. Immigration looks one way, foreign policy looks one way. And if you define America culturally, primarily by reference to Anglo-Protestant values, it looks very different. Let me try to describe the difference more abstractly for anybody interested in political theory. We see that these two visions of American identity have radically different implications for policy and public life. Creedal patriotism is primarily affection for our homes, loyalty to our neighbors, in the American context, dedication to American ideals. America is defined by the ideals of liberty, as reflected in the Constitution and the Declaration. These ideals are, we think, universal, but America is the story of living these ideals out in this land and striving towards that goal, to be ever more, to perfect this union ever more and more, and to live up to these ideals better and better as the years go by. We love our country, we cultivate the best of our history, and we strive to embody our ideals in the future. Nationalism is different than that. I want to really belabor this point because oftentimes nationalists will try to say that they advance nothing more than love of country. Well, love of country is just what I said, it's patriotism. Nationalism as a theory depends upon a whole lot of other ideas. Nationalism is a fairly complex theory about human life is best organized. It asserts that there are these things called nations. These nations are not simply territories under a common rule, but that they are groups of people defined by a common trait, language, religion, culture, or heritage. Nationalism is the belief that these cultural groups should form the basis of political organization. Nationalism is the belief that nations and the people in them flourish best when they govern themselves without interference. Nationalism is the belief that national units should be the fundamental units of political organization and international relations. Nationalists believe that governments should promote and protect the nation's unique, particular cultural identity. It actually adds a whole swath of jurisdiction to what governments are supposed to do. And that means that the government is supposed to encourage whatever trait defines that nation, and discourage, and maybe even outlaw, traits that fall outside national identity. And so nationalists believe that America is and must remain defined as a nation of predominantly Anglo-Protestant culture. And by the way, I am trying to frame their argument in the strongest terms. There's a weaker version of the argument that stresses ethnicity and race. We all know that white supremacy is bad and evil. I'm trying not to engage with that, but engage with what I think to be the more sophisticated argument about culture, not race. Now, this can get confusing because there are lots of things we do to celebrate America that can really be interpreted either way. Much of what we do to celebrate American identity is, I'd say, ambiguous on this question of creed or culture. Celebrating national holidays, days of prayer, flags and anthems, parades, monuments and memorials, national museums, historical sites and battlefields, national cemeteries, statues, unifying symbols, and on and on and on. Look, I love them all because I'm a patriot and I love this country, like Travis said and concluded his remarks. I am proud to be an American, as Mark mentioned. I'm a veteran of the armed forces. I think there's nothing wrong and everything right with celebrating our country, loving our country, being proud of our country. And all these things that's listed off are great ways of doing that. That's why I have no objection to any of those practices on their face, because they don't require us to celebrate one version of American identity against the other version of American identity. I am sometimes cautious about these celebrations because of their ambiguity. They can sometimes subtly reinforce the notion that what we're celebrating are not the ideals, but the culture. That we're not celebrating America's aspirations, but we're celebrating Anglo-Protestant culture. Or they can even, these celebrations, imply that the two versions of identity are the same. What I want to say as a patriot is that we can and should patriotically love our country without believing that it constitutes a nation in that thick sense. that it does not constitute a people of shared traits. Because we don't. We are wonderfully pluralistic and diverse. I think we can be patriots without believing that our government, the jurisdiction of our government necessarily should overlap perfectly with the boundary lines of an imagined cultural group. We can be patriots without believing that our government should take upon itself the responsibility of protecting and promoting and orchestrating a universal cultural template for the whole nation. I think we can be patriots without insisting that our government engage in a competition, a zero-sum competition for prestige and power with other nations in the world. And so I want to rescue this notion of patriotism from nationalism and say to you, give you permission to call yourselves patriots and love this country without falling into the traps that I see coming with nationalism. So what are the implications of this for international affairs, for America's foreign policy? Let me give you a few thoughts on what I think is the justice of internationalism as opposed to nationalism. The justice of internationalism as opposed to nationalism. Okay, what do I mean by internationalism? I essentially mean the international application of the American creed. If we believe that all are created equal, and that the governments ought to treat us with dignity and respect, we sort of ought to apply that internationally and treat other countries, other states and governments, and the people within them with equal dignity and respect. This results in what today is called the liberal international order. It is a system of ordered liberty among nations. A system of ordered liberty among nations. It's a system that's grown over 4 centuries to allow equal sovereignty among all the 195 states in the world, but also has pressure points, pressuring these states to respect their people, their individuals, through things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Like, that's what makes the order liberal, because we are trying to encourage all countries in the world to be liberal in their policies towards their own people. That's why it is just. This liberal international order is I don't think it's intrinsically just, it is instrumentally just because it is the best mechanism that we have yet invented for the achievement of a just and lasting peace among nations in the world. That's the summa bonum, that's the goal, is peace and justice, a lasting peace and justice among nations in the world. And what we have built over the past, since World War II, is a mechanism for achieving the best shot we've got at that peace and justice that we've ever seen in the world. This liberal international order is not inconsistent with national sovereignty. It is not inconsistent with national sovereignty. Nationalists, like President Trump, regularly say that he wants to reinforce national sovereignty over against the globalists who want to do away with it. And I think that is a false dichotomy. Holding up national sovereignty against the liberal order. That's a false dichotomy. It doesn't exist. There might be a few folks out there who want to do away with sovereignty and impose world government. I don't know. That's not me, and it's not the community of people who advocate for internationalism that I know of. The liberal international order rests upon sovereign governments, and would not exist without sovereign governments. So yes, I affirm and uphold the goodness of sovereignty, understood as responsibility for the common good. Internationalism is, in one sense, the habits of good neighborliness among nations. That's all it is. It's being a good neighbor in the neighborhood of nations. It's having polite consideration for how our behavior affects others, and it's the mature recognition that others' safety and prosperity matters to us. It's that reciprocal, mutual concern within the family of nations. That's all internationalism is. I've got kids, aged 10, 9, and 6, and they're very young, and they have no conception of the consequences of their actions. And they're very selfish, and they don't understand how their behavior affects everyone else in the household they live in. They're my roommates, and they're sloppy, and they're selfish, and they're messy, right? But as we grow up and gain maturity, we learn how to be better roommates, right? And hopefully you're learning that in college with your dorm rooms, and hopefully married people out here are good roommates with their spouses, right? And so as you mature, you gain more consideration for the others in your immediate household and your neighborhood. That's maturity. Internationalism is a form of political maturity in the family of nations. America First is kind of juvenile. That's my critique here, is that it's very short-sighted. It's like the toddler version of foreign policy. You know, insisting upon my interests, only my interests, I'm just gonna look down and not look out at the neighborhood nations and ignore how my actions affect other people. It's very short-sighted. Liberal order. Internationalism recognizes that liberal order, the free world order, is the outer perimeter of American security. Liberal order is the outer perimeter of American security. Liberal order is the outer perimeter of American security. When a speaker repeats himself 3 times, that's his main point. Also the thesis of my last book. Liberal order is also a chief engine of American prosperity and a chief tool of American influence, by the way. So it's a good and just thing. Let me conclude with some thoughts on the case against nationalism. I've just spoken to you on what I think are the virtues of internationalism and the American creed applied internationally. Let me conclude with a few thoughts on what I think are the flaws or foolishness of nationalism. I have 7 or 8 points against nationalism, and because of time, I can only assert them rather than argue for them. I look forward to debating afterwards. First, nationalism is impractical. Government lacks the competence to orchestrate culture. You can barely deliver the mail. I don't know why anyone would think that the government has the capability to sustain, create, or orchestrate a common national cultural template for 320 million people. It just can't. Second, nationalism is unnecessary. And here's my rebuttal to the argument that we must sustain our Anglo-Protestant culture to sustain our democratic ideals. I'm here to share the good news that the Constitution and the Declaration and the ideals of them can exist and thrive outside the cultural context of Anglo-Protestantism. Anglo-Protestantism, yes, it was absolutely the originating conditions of liberal democracy in the world. That's a true historical statement. That does not mean that Anglo-Protestantism is the necessary precondition for liberal democracy elsewhere in the world in the future. Originating preconditions and necessary preconditions are different things. The pristine case happened in 18th century Britain. Yay. Does that mean we need to export 18th century Britain all around the world? No, you can't do that. And we didn't do that, and happily you can look around the world and see liberal democracies existing and thriving all around the world today in non-Western, non-European, non-Christian cultures and climates, everywhere from Japan to India, Botswana to Kiribati to South Korea, and I could list off 36 other non-Western, non-Christian countries. And if your immediate response is, well, yeah, that's because of Western imperialism, the answer is no. I wrote a paper on that. I'll talk to you afterwards. Third, nationalism is incoherent. The definition of the nation keeps changing, and there is no decision principle to resolve our dispute for us about what the shared definition of the nation is supposed to be. Nationalism cannot account for cross-cutting identities. It insists that we fit our identity into one identity category, the one that they deem to be the one most important. It insists that we identify with just one group, when in fact all of us have multiple affinity groups. The way we combine our particular set of group affinities rarely lines up with the way others group their group affinities. And so I'm glad that I have a lot of different aspects to whom I am. And I don't really want the government telling me which aspect of my personhood is supposed to be most politically relevant, or which one qualifies me as being a real American. I think what makes me a real American is I'm a citizen. I was born here, and I agree with the Constitution, and I'm loyal to it. And so forth, nationalism ends up being illiberal. Illiberal. Nationalists, because of the incoherence, try to resolve this dispute by fiat, by simply decreeing to us what our national identity is supposed to be. That is why nationalists today are increasingly strident that America is supposed to be a country of Anglo-Protestantism. But who gave them the authority to say? Who gave them the authority to tell us who we are? In a country dedicated to freedom, we ought to be free to explore, to discover, to reinvent American history and American identity, to adapt, revise, reject, and recreate our heritage and our national identity. And so fifth, nationalism is counterproductive. Counterproductive. When nationalists or a nationalist government tries to impose a cultural template, it will inevitably produce a backlash by those who don't belong, or who are excluded, or who don't want to belong in that definition of Americanness. That's what leads to a never-ending culture war. Culture war happens when the government decides it's in charge of telling us what our culture is, and people have a disagreement about what that culture ought to be. And so we have this never-ending culture war. There's a reason why every culture war battle ends up being called a new form of McCarthyism, because McCarthy was the first culture warrior. He insisted we had to fit his model of what it means to be an American. And that kicked off our culture war. Sixth, nationalism is unjust. Orchestrating culture is simply not within the government's rightful jurisdiction. Full stop. Seventh, nationalism is therefore un-American. In a very real sense, America was not founded as a homeland of a certain cultural type. Or at the very most, I could say, some of them did believe America should be home of a certain cultural type, and they're the ones who seceded in 1861, and they were thankfully defeated on the battlefield. And so, lastly, I'll say nationalism is irresponsible. It is internationally irresponsible. It can deteriorate into a selfish and belligerent form of political behavior on the international stage. So if I haven't offended enough, I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi, I'm Aiden McGee from Newton College. So I think that often for people who have grown up in a system where nationalism is seen as a positive term, it can be difficult to have a productive conversation that convinces people that the rewards of conformity to a more basic American identity that instead upholds the ideals of the Constitution, that lie sort of below the Anglo-Protestant culture that seems to be dominant at this time in American history, can be really difficult. So how would you go about convincing somebody who's coming from that standpoint of nationalism that what they want is conformity to American ideals over culture?
So you're asking me how would I go about trying to convince somebody that we should define ourselves primarily by the ideals and not culture? I would encourage them to meet and befriend and spend time with people who are different than they are, who are also Americans. And that's a great way of coming to recognize, hey, look, America doesn't depend on being like I am, talking like I do, looking like I do, or even coming from the same kind of background I do, going to the same church I do. Like, it's good to experience that difference, and that is actually what I think empathetically grows our hearts, so that we can be a more culturally ecumenical. I think that was certainly true of my life. Yes,
quick comment and then a question. The comment is that I find it incredibly perplexing and baffling to see conservative and traditionalist Catholics defending nationalism, which tried to stomp out the Catholic Church throughout most of the 19th century, on the grounds of an Anglo-Protestant identity specifically created to exclude Catholics.
I agree.
That being said, what's interesting about the Anglo-Protestant frame is, isn't there a sense in which Anglo-Protestantism really originally is kind of creedal? I mean, the idea of being a quote-unquote good Englishman until the 1830s requires you to be a Protestant. And Protestantism is sort of based on a creedal notion, a notion of sort of commitment to a certain set of beliefs and values. So I guess maybe you can explain, since you're putting the best case forward, how is that seen as a form of cultural nationalism and not creedal?
Yes, thank you for that. So again, I think what you're getting at is the close tie between the culture and the creed and the historical circumstance that the culture gave rise to the creed. And again, that's absolutely true historically. There's no doubt about that. What's interesting is that today, I think those who make the appeal to culture tend to overlook the creedal content. Yeah, which is one of my chief complaints about it. I also want to add my observation that you no longer have to have the culture for the creed to take hold around the world. And that is an empirical observation about the state of the world today that often gets overlooked or dismissed or downplayed by folks who somehow think that non-Western democracies are somehow sort of fake or not worth as much. But look, I think Indian democracy exists and it's real, and we should celebrate that and recognize it doesn't depend upon Anglo culture. Yes.
Hi, Paul. John Wilsey, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And thank you, brilliant, as always, what we come to expect.
Thank you, next question.
As you know, we've had many discussions about this. I am very sympathetic with your entire thesis. And I just want to ask a question to, just for clarification, as you think through creedal patriotism and nationalism defined by religion, defined by Anglo-Protestantism. Where does history fit into this? Because Americans are still, we still have a shared past experience. We're a pluralistic nation, and different groups have different histories. I'm thinking primarily blacks, whites, people of color, and so forth, have different experiences in the past, have different histories. But Americans have dealt with that history together, and sometimes, and sometimes faultingly, right? But that shared past experience is also, it seems to be, cultural, and also forming a coherent meta-narrative defining a national identity. So I'm very sympathetic with creedal patriotism, but how does shared past experience fit into your model?
Thank you for the question. And I should share my indebtedness to John, one of your books, entitled American Exceptionalism.
And civil religion, yeah.
And civil religion, yeah. Where you make a distinction between open exceptionalism and closed exceptionalism, influential in my thinking about this. So thank you for that. So check out John's book.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis wrote about patriotism that it depends upon, I'm going to butcher this idea here. He gets at this idea of history being a part of our patriotism. It's something about cherishing the best of our past and wanting to participate in a shared future. And I like that formulation. We all have ancestrally very different backgrounds in America, and that's part of what makes us great. We should not try to force ourselves into one story of where we came from, because that's just false.
Right.
I think what we should do, patriotically, is to teach American history, teach it truly, teach about our failings as much as our successes. And by the way, that's where nationalists will sometimes differ. They say, no, let's focus on the good stuff.
Right.
No, we need to focus on our failings as well, and then focus on how we can do better in the future. That, I think, is a good patriotic or creedal understanding of American history.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
More time. Great. Okay.
Any more questions?
Yeah, particular student, yeah.
Luke Gelling from Sci College. So in your talk, you say that ideals, democratic ideals, can be transferred to different cultures. Are there any cultural preconditions that you can think of that are necessary for democracy to take place, or do you say it's completely not connected to culture?
So I looked at this question from my first book, and there's no scholarly consensus. And I think Huntington actually did a survey of the literature, and he said, well, there's been 17 different variables proposed as the essential precondition. And none of them are persuasive as the master variable. And everything has been proposed, like income and culture and Protestantism and roads and mountain. So it's very inconclusive. I'll note that many of the things that would make democracy easier simply make government easier. Like being rich makes democracy more likely. That's true. It also makes autocracy easier because you can tax people and fund your secret police, right? So the question is, what is the dispositive, the distinctive variable that makes democracy more likely than other forms of government? And honestly, I think the answer is people who believe in democracy, right? If you have the presence of people with access to resources who believe in these ideas, that makes democracy more likely. And if you don't have them, you're not going to have democracy, right? So I think that's probably the best answer I can give you that is distinctive to that form of government.
Gordon Middleton, Patrick Henry College. I'd like to try to ask two questions. First, unless I missed it, I didn't seem to hear much perspective from Scripture associated with your ideas. How do you deal, for example, with the fact that in Scripture, the existence of nations, if not nation state per se, seem to be replete, as opposed to the more globalist perspective which you seem to project? Secondly, if we accept your premise and conclusions, to what extent does that, as Christians, essentially disarm us in our internal domestic cultural dialogue and discussion, for example, on sexual orientation and transgender issues, if our identity is solely at this idea level, separate from culture?
So I'll take the second question first. I think the doctrine of liberal neutrality is our best friend. Liberal neutrality is what is keeping alive a lot of Christian churches, organizations, Bible studies, things that meet in public areas like schools. They exist because of the doctrine of liberal neutrality. If we get rid of neutrality, because we don't like drag queen story hour, we will lose access. We Christians, our churches, our Bible studies will lose access to school cafeterias across the nation. Thousands of churches will be homeless. So neutrality is essential for protecting our access to public resources. And this is, David French is far more eloquent than I do. So I refer you to his work. Okay, your first question was much harder. And remember what it was? Scripture, yeah. And Act 17.
And the existence of nations,
Yeah.
and as opposed to a more globalist,
Yeah.
universalist perspective.
Yeah, so there's a passage in, I think it's Act 17, that says, God has set out the times for the nations of the earth, or something to that effect. I don't think that means nation states, and I don't think it implies the full political ideology of 19th century nationalism as I articulated here. It does not mean we have to believe in the existence of internally coherent, mutually distinct cultural units that get their own governments. It just means that God is providentially in charge of all things. He has created all peoples. There's no one master race, right? I think that's kind of part of what that passage is getting at. And we can celebrate in the diversity of creation. Why didn't I spend more time in the Bible? Because I only have 25 minutes. And there's a much longer argument here about the Christian basis of liberal, pre-18th century liberalism, Augustinian liberalism, that I would love to give you at another time. That shares my view on why we as Christians can look to the Bible to embrace certain liberal practices like representation, minority reps, and so forth. But it's not time. Sorry, that's an insufficient answer. Here.
Nick Carlson, Liberty University. You talked about how viewpoint neutrality is our best friends as Christians. Without it, we'd be kicked out of the square. So I guess my question is, aren't we as Christians being kicked out of the square right now in the name of viewpoint neutrality? I believe Sohrab Ahmari's point is that right now, in the name of liberalism, in the name of viewpoint neutrality, our ideas are being squashed, and it's not happening like it should. Free exchange of ideas.
Yeah. Great question. So I think Sohrab is correct about that. Now my challenge is, what's the right answer? Is it to throw out neutrality, the aspiration towards neutrality altogether, and just try to fight back by exiling all of our opponents from the public square? Or is the answer to reaffirm the proper understanding of neutrality? Right? You got to understand what's going on is that progressivism, invented about 100 years ago, borrows the language and rhetoric of liberalism, but actually does sort of the opposite conceptually of what liberalism really does stand for. And so they claim that they're out for liberty and equality, while they're actually, as you say, kicking people out of the public square and imposing a sort of progressive orthodoxy on the public square. So I think our solution is to reaffirm old-style, pre-progressive, 18th century liberalism. And that's much better than the alternative, which is essentially a kind of form of nostalgia for Christendom. It's completely infeasible. Last one.
Good afternoon, Chongwen Lee, PhD candidate at American University. My question is, one of the often criticisms raised against the liberal international order is this idea that it sets a double standard in which, say, countries like the United States is often forced to pay a greater burden for other countries, say, NATO countries. So my question is, in your definition of liberal international order, does it emphasize like equal playing field for all countries, or does it include the idea that, for instance, a biblical principle, country that has a moral obligation to go a little above and beyond to take care of those who are countries that are less fortunate, for instance?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I say is I'm most interested in defending the principles of a liberal international order. I acknowledge that the actually existing liberal order needs some revision, needs some updating, needs to be readjusted here and there in the margins. But I want to emphasize, fundamentally, it's good, it's just, it's worth keeping. Okay, now let's have a conversation about how to make it look better. Better burden sharing? Sure. Every president for 70 years has said that. Trump's not unique in that. He's right about that. I think Trump's kind of bad about how he goes about it, but, another question. Do bigger states have more responsibility? Yeah, I think so. Not because of superior moral virtue, but because of superior power. To him who's been given much will be expected. Or it's sometimes called the Spider-Man doctrine of international relations, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Students write that in term paper once. So yeah, I do think that great powers do have more responsibility to because it's inescapable. Great powers will affect the character of world order whether they want to or not. Whether you choose to or not to, you do, and so you better choose to do it deliberately in the right direction. Thank you very much.